Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome. Look at us moving all around here. Maybe try to lock that in place. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where these videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phones. I hope that you'll join us this Friday, November 8th, for the annual Veterans Day ceremony at 10:30 a.m. outside on the Entergy Plaza that will include a performance by the 41st Army Band. Admission to the museums will be free for veterans or active duty military, along with a guest on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Friday is also the last day to see the Flags from Mississippi Emblems Through Time exhibit. So I hope that you'll take advantage of that. And I hope that you'll come back next week for History's Lunch when Charbrion Plummer will present Black Quilters in the American South. That program is in partnership with the Mississippi Humanities Council and in conjunction with the exhibition of Salt and Spirit that's opening November 16th at the Mississippi Museum of Art. We also have some quilts by Henderson Rankin in the collection, and after the talk next week, we'll take a couple of groups through anybody who wants to go down and see those following the talk. So another reason to come back. Today, we are delighted to welcome back our friend Tom Henderson to present Fallen Comrade, 3 Mississippi Marines in the Korean War. Tom's talk is based on a book by Clinton historian Walter Howell, who suffered a stroke after he finished the manuscript and asked Tom to do the final edits, to gather the photographs, and work with University Press of Mississippi to see the book through to its publication. Tom Henderson holds a BA in History from the University of Southern Mississippi and an MLS from Florida State University. Before retiring as director of the Millsaps College Library, he worked as an archivist at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, as architecture librarian at Mississippi State University, and as patent, trademark, and government documents librarian at the Mississippi Library Commission. But you know, it's always the quiet ones that scare you a little bit. Tom also was the first person to give a History's Lunch presentation and be invited to come back immediately and give the exact same presentation because it was so popular, folks couldn't get into the room to hear it. So, what was it, 10, 15 years ago, Tom gave a talk on the Gold Coast when we were still over in the Winter Building, and we had to have him right back to give the same talk again. Help me welcome Tom Henderson to the stage.
Particularly the 3 men and some of their friends. Dr. Howell writes about their experiences, the horrors of war, their bravery and heroism, the tragic deaths of 2 of the men, and the success of the 3rd. Walter Howell has a PhD in history and taught at Mississippi College for many years before serving as mayor of Clinton. In retirement, he pursued a number of local history research projects, including Town and Gown, A History of Clinton and Mississippi College, published in 2014 and recently reprinted. He also wrote Preachers and the People Called Methodists in Clinton, published in 2018. And he edited and annotated the long-lost volumes of John Griffin Jones' A Complete History of Methodism in Mississippi, published by the Methodist Conference in 2015. And this book, Fallen Comrade, published earlier this year. The idea for Fallen Comrade originated with an article he wrote for the Clinton Courier about Joe Albritton and Homer Ainsworth's experiences in the war. He believed there was a larger story to tell and began research for the book by interviewing their close friend, Walter King. He talked with many other people who knew the young men, found their letters, newspaper articles, and photographs. and in primary and secondary resources, he discovered how the young men from Clinton fit into the larger context of the war. As Chris pointed out, he had finished the second draft and already contracted with the press to publish it when he suffered a stroke in 2021. I'm proud to have had a small part in the book, but it is Walter Howell's book. Joe Albritton, Homer Ainsworth, and Walter King grew up in Clinton and were part of a large group of childhood friends. They played together, attended church together, and were the children of close-knit families with strong ties to Clinton and to Mississippi College. Joe was the mischievous adventurer, Homer and Walter much less so. In high school, Joe's reputation for fast driving complemented his daredevil nature, one friend recalling that Joe lived in a state of anarchy. His parents, Dick and Martha Albritton, were living in Clarksdale when their two sons were born, but moved to Clinton in 1931 when Dick became bursar at Mississippi College. Growing up, Joe liked to drive fast and was quite mechanically inclined. Once his father bought a surplus B-26 engine for Joe and his friends to tinker with, taking it apart, putting it back together. One night, however, Joe managed to actually start the engine, waking up half the town, I'm sure. In high school, Joe was vice president of the junior class and a 3-year letterman in football. He was interested in photography and automobile repair. He was also interested in Peggy Kane, a school beauty with whom he had a secret courtship. Joe graduated high school in 1949 and attended Mississippi College, along with a dozen of his classmates. Homer, a preacher's son, was a little bit more serious. His parents, Homer and Mary Lee Tullis, lived in McGee when Homer was born. They moved to Clinton in the 1930s, where Homer Sr. worked at the service station. He was a part-time preacher and a part-time football coach. Homer Jr. was active in the Boy Scouts, earning his Eagle Badge in high school. He was also active in the Future Farmers of America. He was a summer counselor at Camp Garraway and a swimming instructor at the college pool. He graduated with Joe in 1949 and attended Hines Junior College. Walter was bright, well-behaved, and a good athlete, and was voted most likely to succeed. His parents, Baby John and Mary Ryler King, moved to Clinton from Brookhaven in 1938. In high school, Walter was voted most intelligent. He was president of the Key Club and captain of the football team. He was in the class of 1950 and had planned to study geology and had signed up to play football at Ole Miss. Just as a caveat, I'll say some of the photographs that are in my slideshow are not in the book for a variety of reasons, but mostly due to the poor quality of the originals. Perhaps inspired by World War II veterans they knew and a belief that the Marine Corps was the elite American military service, all three of the boys joined the Marine Reserves. Walter had joined in March of 1949 in his junior year in high school. Joe and Homer joined a few months later while they were freshmen in college. Two of their older friends, Bill Smith and George Sharp, had already joined the Marines, and in the summer of 1950, they all went to Marine Corps summer training. Joe, Homer, and Walter were sent to Marine Base Quantico in Virginia, and Bill and George, because they had already been to basic training, were sent to Camp Pendleton, California. They all expected to pick up where they left off when they returned home that summer. But when North Korea invaded South Korea, things changed quickly. The Jackson Marine Corps Reserve Unit was activated on August 28, 1950, and those 5 Clinton men were sent back to Camp Pendleton for training. George Sharp went directly to 12 weeks of combat training. Bill Smith was assigned to the 11th Artillery Regiment and would soon leave for Korea. Walter, Joe, and Homer, however, were sent directly to boot camp. Boot camp was a physical and mental challenge that high school football had hardly prepared them for. Part of their training was spent in the California mountains that winter, and they didn't know then how valuable that experience would be in Korea. Homer wrote to his high school friend Ralph Marston, "The weather is so cold, one of Joe's balls froze off. I don't know what he's going to do. I see a lot of fellows fall out every day and guess they just can't take it. But the boys from Mississippi would not be stopped." In another, more serious letter to his parents, Homer described the winter training as the hardest part of the experience. Joe and I stayed out about 10 miles in the mountains last night. We only had a blanket roll. In December, the three returned home to Clinton for the holidays. While at home, Joe secretly married his high school sweetheart, Peggy, which was a huge surprise to Homer and Waller and almost everyone else. George Sharp completed his combat training, and in January, he shipped out to Korea, where he joined the 5th Marine Regiment near Busan. He was in Operation Thunderbolt as the Marines moved north out of the Busan perimeter. After Christmas, Joe, Homer, and Waller returned to Camp Pendleton for their final 12 weeks of training. During that time, they and several hundred other Marines served as extras in Flying Leathernecks, a John Wayne movie filmed at Camp Pendleton. Apparently ignoring orders not to fraternize with the star, Joe and Homer somehow managed to get pictures taken with him. After basic training, they shipped out to Korea. Joe and Homer's troop ship arrived in Busan on the southern tip of Korea on April 5th. They were both assigned to the 3rd Platoon of the George Company in the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment. They were soon on their way to a defensive position called Line, Kansas in North Korea. Waller's ship landed about a week later. He was assigned to the 1st Marine Regiment's Headquarters and Services Company, and he soon found himself on the way to the Marine base at Hongchan. The Korean War is sometimes called America's Forgotten War. In the introduction, Dr. Howell writes, just 5 years after the end of World War II, the Korean conflict interrupted the post-war peace. The war was never popular with the American people, and with the Vietnam War and its social and political conflicts in the next decade, the war in Korea was forgotten. Dr. Howell describes the war from beginning to end, interweaving the actions of the Clinton men with the war and international politics. I added the red captions and boxes to this map to show you where the major events were in which the Clinton men were involved. Korea had been a vassal state of Japan for 40 years until it was arbitrarily divided into what became North and South Korea during World War II, roughly along the 38th parallel, which is the curved line in the center of the map. North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, and quickly advanced south, taking Seoul and other cities. U.S. and UN forces under General MacArthur were pushed back to the area around Busan, called the Busan Perimeter. MacArthur had already moved 2 divisions of the 8th Army's occupational forces from Japan, but he knew he needed Marine support. He hastily formed the 1st Provisional Brigade of the Marines, which joined the 8th Army to rout the North Koreans from Busan. In September, MacArthur launched an ambitious amphibious invasion at Incheon with an armada of 260 ships loaded with Marines. They quickly took Incheon and then Seoul and its airport, and a few days later, MacArthur ceremoniously returned the capital. US and UN forces continued north, joining the units which had broken out of the Busan perimeter. Finally given permission to pursue the North Koreans beyond the 38th parallel, MacArthur led forces deep into North Korea. In November and December, the war was concentrated west of the Chosin Reservoir. But by then, the Chinese had entered the war in huge numbers. The unexpected presence of the Chinese, combined with poor planning and unbelievably bad weather, resulted in the Marine retreat from the Chosin Reservoir, and US and UN forces were pushed back south of the 38th parallel. After regrouping, US and UN forces advanced again north to the Iron Triangle and Punch Bowl area. After 5 months of hard fighting in the rough terrain there, and with tremendous casualties on both sides, the war changed dramatically from a warfare of movement to a warfare of position, during which both sides were strung out along a series of outposts, frequently skirmishing but with few major attacks. The Korean War would grind on until July 1953, ending in a draw with borders between the North and South roughly the same as they had been before the war started. About 1 million American and UN forces served in Korea. Among the 37,000 Americans killed were 376 from Mississippi and 1 from Clinton. By contrast, the Chinese and North Koreans suffered almost 1.5 million casualties. In this talk, I want to focus on a few engagements the Clinton men were in, sometimes using their own words to describe the action. Navy medic Herbert Pierce was the first young man from Clinton to serve in Korea. He was a year older than Joe and Homer and had joined the Navy right out of high school. His father was a professor at Mississippi College. At that time, the Navy provided medics for the Marines. So Pierce found himself in a Marine uniform attached to the 5th Regiment. Pierce was in the breakout from Busan and in the Incheon invasion. Pierce will be followed by a number of men from Clinton who served in Korea. This roster appeared in the Clinton News in May of 1951 at the height of the fighting. Herbert Pierce and Bill Smith were in the Chosin Reservoir campaign, where the Marines slugged it out along a narrow road surrounded by steep mountains and constant fire from the Chinese, in an ill-advised attempt to join with the 8th Army north of the reservoir. Unfortunately, the Chinese drove the Army back and stopped the Marines at Udam-ni in November of 1950. Udam-ni is the northernmost town up there. Deadly fighting continued in sub-zero temperatures and deep snow. The 5th and 7th Marine Regiments had maintained their positions against 3 Chinese divisions, but facing continued threats in the difficult terrain, they began a withdrawal from Chosin back to the port of Hungnam on December 1st. The breakout from the Chosin Reservoir was a dramatic success for the Marines. When a reporter asked General Oliver Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, if the Marines were retreating, he said, "A surrounded force cannot retreat. It can only attack in a new direction." The book's day-by-day account of the Chosin Reservoir operation reveals the amazing advance and the desperate attack in a new direction in what was the most dangerous operation of the Marines in the Korean War. Survivors of Chosin called themselves the Chosen Few. Herbert Pierce and Bill Smith made it to the northernmost point of the Marine advance, and they survived the retreat. Clintonians knew about the breakout from Chosin, but Bill's wife had not heard anything about him until a ham operator in Oregon relayed a message that Bill was alive and in a hospital in Japan. Herbert's parents eventually received a letter from him. He was safe and in reserve at Busan. Both men, however, suffered from frostbite, and Pierce was wounded by mortar fire. They were hospitalized and eventually returned to the States in 19native. He was shot down at the Chosin Reservoir on December 2nd while giving air cover to the last Marines leaving Udam-ni. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Hudner, attempted to rescue him, but it was too late. The story of Brown and Hudner is told in a book, Devotion, by Adam Mikos, and in a film of the same title released in 2022. Oh, this is a Marine Corps photograph showing some of the members of the 5th and 7th Regiments stalled out on the road as they were attacking in a different direction. You can get a sense of the weather conditions there. When Joe, Homer, and Waller arrived in Korea in April of 1951, the Marines were again on the offensive, moving north to the Iron Triangle and Punch Bowl area northeast of Seoul. The red box on this map shows where they and George Sharp experienced most of the fighting. In their position above Line, Kansas, Homer and Joe's 7th Regiment was on the left, George Sharp's regiment was in the middle, and the Korean Marine Corps on the right. Walter King's 1st Regiment was in reserve at that time, but would soon join the action. On April 22nd, they had their first encounter with the Chinese, which Joe described in a letter home. About 3:30 that afternoon, we started hitting the enemy in large numbers, about a mile south of the Quantico line. We got to the line about 10 o'clock that night. By then, our casualties were very high, and we were unorganized because we had lost so many, and it was dark. The enemy was heavily dug in on the ridge, and it would have been suicide for us to try to take it that night. So we moved in at the bottom of the hill and tried to hold there. From then on, it was a steady, bloody battle that raged all night until the next morning. Their platoon leader, Charles McAtee, said the Chinese made noises with whistles, and they were shouting and singing as they came over the ridgeline into the pocket of death where we mowed them down. However, the Marines were forced to withdraw from that position. Waller's unit retreated to the town of Chuncheon, which they had been ordered to destroy. Chuncheon is the blue dot on this map. Waller wrote, Chuncheon was a real town, about the size of Brookhaven, my birthplace. One of the truly tragic things about war is the effect on innocent civilians who may be caught up, unable to escape. My squad was ordered to destroy anything of value. That meant burning with flamethrowers and phosphorus grenades any standing structure. Surely it must be against the rules of the Geneva Convention to do what we did, but we had broken just about all the rules anyway. Just think if this was my hometown. We left Chuncheon in flames. This photo, by the way, was taken by Joe Albritton. Their letters and comments revealed the harsh realities of war. Commenting on a bloody attack at Moray Kege Pass on May 17th, fellow Marine Jim Nicholson said, the 3rd Battalion stopped the Chinese, inflicting more than 900 casualties. We killed them all. There's no second prize in warfare. This photo shows Joe Albritton standing among the dead Chinese soldiers after that attack. By late May, the Chinese were suffering tremendous casualties and had overextended their supply lines. U.S. and UN leaders decided to take back control of Line Kansas. In early June, the Marines reached a ridge near the southern tip of the Punch Bowl, a dormant volcanic crater shown in the blue circle. Joe and Homer's 7th Regiment went into reserve, while Waller and George's regiments continued the assault toward Line Kansas. But on June 18th, the 7th Regiment was called back to combat against an enemy prepared to defend the ridges to death. The red circle there shows their approximate location at that time. The next day, June 19th, Homer and Joe's G Company lanced off Joe's helmet, striking and killing another Marine nearby. And then Joe rolled away just in time before a grenade exploded right next to him. Their company attacked the ridge crest 5 times, but was forced to withdraw each time. In one attack, their 1st squad moved up behind the 3rd squad and was pinned down near a Chinese machine gun nest. Joe wrote about what happened next. Up until then, we had had 3 killed and 1 wounded in our squad that day, but then it happened. The next shells hit right in the middle of us. I don't know why I was spared, but God has a reason. I know, or I wouldn't be here today. I have seen many men killed since I've been over here, but it really hurts to the limit to see someone as close as Homer and I were in friendship taken away. Jim Nicholson, who was nearby in the 3rd Squad, recalled, it was the day the 1st Squad died, attempting to take another senseless hill in another senseless battle. Tragically, Homer and the other members of his squad were killed by friendly fire. These photos are from Jim Nicholson's book about G Company and were very likely taken by Joe. The caption says one of the men in the photo on the left is Homer Ainsworth, a short time before he was killed. And I believe that's Homer on the right side of that photograph. The other photo shows members of George Company's 3rd Platoon. Many of the men at the end of the line were among those killed on June 19th. Joe was heartbroken at the loss of Homer, but he lived up to the Marine tradition to never leave the dead and wounded on the battlefield. He wrote, "We couldn't take any of the bodies off the hill until after dark. I got another guy to help me take Homer's body down, which was the saddest thing I've ever had to do or ever hoped to do. We took the rest of the hill the next morning." Homer's family was devastated by the news, as was the whole town. At a memorial service later that summer, Joe's letter to the Ainsworth family was read. "I have lost the best friend I ever had. I want you to know that Homer did not suffer. He was fully prepared to meet the Lord. It may be a while before we see him again, or it may be tomorrow. We just don't know." In November, Homer's body was finally returned to Clinton for burial in the Clinton Cemetery. By midsummer, U.S. and UN forces held favorable defensive positions from the west coast at Incheon across the peninsula to the Sea of Japan. Waller had transferred from regimental headquarters to the weapons company of the 2nd Battalion, where he patrolled a sector of Line, Kansas with Easy Company. Joe had transferred from George Company to the 3rd Battalion's headquarters and services company, but he too patrolled a section of the front line. After another collapse of peace talks in August of 1951, U.S. and UN forces launched intensive ground and airstrikes around the Punch Bowl. The sharp ridges were dotted with hills, some of them numbered, and all intensely fought for by Joe, Waller, and George's regiments. In September, in the battle for Hill 749, for instance, all three men were located along the same front, northeast of the Punch Bowl, but they were unaware at the time of their proximity. Waller described the fight for that hill. "We had reports of heavy fighting that the 7th Marines were encountering, and we were to relieve them immediately. The Marines were taking a series of peeks, all in hell's playground. And we were there now, feeling sort of confident. Then we came upon the wounded and dead of the 7th Marines. The survivors were dirty, tired. They had that far-away look. We heard their story, and we searched their faces for buddies. Waller said he heard the whistles and explosions of shells. They say you don't hear the one that gets you. I heard these, so I guess I'm still here." George Sharp in the 5th Regiment also wrote about the bloody fighting there. As his company was moving up a hill to relieve another company, he wrote, "We met a train of Korean stretcher bearers coming down with the dead and wounded. It was the most amount of Marine blood we had ever seen, and it wasn't at all comforting, knowing that a lot of us would be riding down the hill, Marine Regiment, on patrol in the terrain, in the rough terrain around the Punch Bowl." The Korean War's foremost tactical innovation was the expanded use of helicopters. You can think about scenes from MASH. The photo in the upper right, taken by Waller, is a Sikorsky helicopter commonly used in Korea. Joe and Waller were involved in a couple of historic helicopter firsts in Korea. Waller got the ride of his life in Operation Blackbird, the first and only large-scale nighttime airlift of combat troops in Korea. On September 27, 1951, 12 helicopters airlifted 228 Marines, including Waller, over 2 ridges behind Chinese lines near the Punch Bowl. And on October the 11th, in Operation Bumblebee, Joe's entire battalion of 958 combat-equipped Marines was airlifted in the 1st battalion-sized airlift. Joe documented that flight with his photograph of his feet dangling out of the helicopter. You can kind of see the outline of his feet right there. Although offensive movements have been halted in the warfare position, skirmishes and small attacks by the Chinese continued, as did the casualties. Marines spent time improving bunkers, clearing lines of fire, and patrolling sectors of the line. These photos show Waller and Joe with their weapons. Joe was a rifleman carrying a Browning automatic rifle, a standard weapon. Waller was the leader of a fire team firing a machine gun. He described the danger of patrolling in mine-infested areas We moved out around 8 o'clock, moved through our minefield without incident. In the squad was one gung-ho corporal who had keen eyes and could spot tripwires or a hidden bouncing Betty mine. Those horrid things would be tripped by the man in front of you, and it would explode about 4 feet off the ground, wounding or killing everybody. Shortly before reaching their objective that day, the squad leader received orders to come back immediately. 2 patrols out ahead of them had been ambushed. By November, the Marines held most of the ridges around the Punch Bowl and were also positioned along a string of outposts west of the Punch Bowl back toward Seoul. George Sharp transferred from the 5th Regiment to the Marine Division Headquarters mail service, as he said, riding shotgun on the northbound mail flights. Joe and Walter's last months in Korea were tedious, mostly focused on surviving each day without harm while on patrol. Walter was promoted to sergeant. Dr. Howell writes, finally, in March 1952, Walter and Joe were going home, but the war hung over them like a dark cloud. On the voyage home, Walter reflected on the war. I don't want to forget Korea's action, its ugliness, its bitterness. It can and will happen again. I want to do my part to keep it from happening again. And I pray to God that He will give us a common understanding and that we will be spared the foolish, ignorant method of settling our disputes. Walter's memories of the war were written down on the voyage home, but not until some 50 years later did he compile them in a booklet called Marines in Korea. Dr. Howell relied heavily on Walter King for much of the information about the Clinton boys' youth and their wartime experiences. In dozens of emails, phone calls, and photographs, Walter shared his memories and his strong desire to have their stories told. Dr. Howell commissioned a number of maps for the book, some of which you've seen today. And some of the photographs were taken by Joe Albritton and Walter King. Others were provided by family, and a few are official Marine Corps photographs. Joe's photographs are an interesting story, though. He had developed an interest in photography in high school and had become quite a photographer. He carried with him a 35mm camera and 20 rolls of film to Korea and took dozens of photographs of fellow Marines, which he offered for sale. He shipped the film home to his father, who had the film developed and printed, and mailed the prints to the soldiers and their families in the States. Packaged in groups of 100 photos, Joe sold more than 1,250 sets of photographs. That's 125,000 pictures. But when Joe explained the business, the officer ordered a set for himself. In 1955, the Clarion Ledger ran a long article about Joe's photographs. Although we found a few of his photos among family members and friends, no complete sets turned up in Dr. Howell's research. Jim Nicholson, who I quoted earlier, included a number of Joe's photos in his book about G Company and may have a complete set, but at the time of our interviews, he didn't know where they were. Here are 2 of his photos, which appeared in the newspaper: George Company on the march and a sad Korean refugee child. And they are stamped from Standard Photo in Jackson, Mississippi. 2 other photos in the book were taken by Clinton photographer George Black. Left to right, and this one shows George Sharp, Walter King, and Joe Albritton in front of the Bank of Clinton, taken in May of 1950 while they were still in the Marine Reserves. After 12 months in Korea, Joe and Walter traveled home to the States on the same ship in late March 1952. They landed in San Francisco and boarded the train to San Diego for discharge. While there, Joe used money from the photo sales to pay cash for a new 1952 Pontiac, which he drove home, probably very fast. Walter's discharge was delayed, so he took the bus, but both were welcomed home by their families and friends. Joe especially was welcomed home by Peggy, both ready to start their married life together. Joe and Walter shared their grief with Homer's family, and they spoke to church and civic groups about their experiences. Instead of returning to college, Joe decided to open an automobile repair shop in Clinton. The business was off to a really good start, but on May 17th, Joe was seriously injured in an automobile accident on Highway 80. He suffered severe injuries and died 2 days later, only a few weeks after returning from the war. He was 21. Dr. Howell writes, "To die in an automobile accident at home after being in harm's way for 12 months in Korea was misfortune beyond belief. Joe had escaped injury when an enemy hand grenade exploded inches away and had survived the mortar explosion that killed Homer Ainsworth. His wife and parents were devastated." B. Quisenberry, writing in the Clinton News, said the news of his accident and death came as a stunning blow to his family and to the hundreds of friends who prayed for his safe return from the fighting lines of Korea. Jim Nicholson remembered Joe as a really, really good Marine, a true on-the-point infantryman carrying a killer BAR. Little Joe had always been there when it hit the fan. Mississippi Judge Henry Lackey, who was Joe's younger cousin, admired Joe. What an energetic, resourceful, and fearless leader he was. Joe was buried only a few feet from Homer. The loss of two of his closest friends, Homer and Joe, gave new meaning to Waller's life. He enrolled at Mississippi College and played football. He married a girl from Memphis and moved there, where he embarked on a successful career with a new motel chain, Holiday Inns. Later, Waller started his own chemical supply company, which for years had an exclusive contract with Holiday Inn. Waller was devoted to his family, his church, to civic affairs, and to the Marine Corps League. He led the drive for a Korean War memorial in Overton Park and continued to be active in veterans organizations, being honored twice as Tennessee's Marine of the Year. Waller died in 2021 and is buried near Homer and Joe. Bill Smith had married Betty Jo Connolly before the war. After being treated for frostbite received in the Chosin Reservoir campaign, he transferred to Camp Lejeune, where he served until his discharge. They lived in Clinton, where he too was active in the Marine Corps League and was proud to be one of the chosen few, although he was haunted by the trauma of Korea. Bill died in 1986. George Sharp came home in February 1952, but continued service in the Marine Corps Reserve. He married Peggy Kane Albritton, Joe's widow. George worked in the building supply and machinery business. Herbert Pierce returned home in 1951 and completed his Navy service at the Memphis Naval Air Station. He received a medical degree from the University of Mississippi and practiced surgery in Jacksonville, Florida for 30 years. He was active in military organizations, including the Chosen Few, and died in 2011. The town of Clinton had no memorial to its veterans, a fact not lost on Dr. Sam Gore, an art professor at Mississippi College. Familiar with the story of Homer and Joe, he proposed a veterans memorial representing their compassion and friendship. In 2009, he began promoting the idea, and on Veterans Day 2012, the memorial was unveiled at the Clinton Visitor Center. Walter King gave the dedication address, a passionate presentation on the U.S. military and the sacrifices of those who had given their lives for the country. Although Dr. Gore envisioned the memorial statue not as a literal representation, but as a general interpretation of compassion and comradeship, almost everyone sees it as Joe carrying Homer from the battlefield. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for questions. If anybody has a question, you can raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you.
You and the newspaper article mentioned 125,000 photos. Was he able to get more film and actually take 125,000 photos, or was that just a printed?
That's how many were printed.
Okay.
If he sold, yeah, he sold them in groups of 100. Yeah, I guess that would be 125,000. I'm not sure how many individual photographs that, I mean, separate images that is.
Right.
But he no doubt bought more film.
I noticed right before you changed the slide, did you notice the picture of Joe and his wife? There was a child between them.
I meant to point that out. I've looked at that picture a dozen times or more, and I only discovered that a few days ago. I don't know who the child is. They had cousins and relatives, I'm sure, but thanks for pointing that out. It's funny. That was taken, obviously, in a short period of time after he came home, and in Clinton somewhere, I'm sure. So.
Other questions? All right. Sometimes we don't have a lot of questions. What we do have is copies of the book. It really is a fantastic read, a fantastic story over here. If you do think of something that you'd like to talk to Tom about, I'm sure he'll be glad to stick around for a little bit and do that. Thank you all for being here today. Come back this Friday, if you can, at 10:30 for our Veterans Day commemoration. And then I hope that we'll see you next week. Got a question? Got a...
I'll take it. This is a personal question. I'd just like to know if there's anybody from the Ainsworth family here today. I don't know if there are any members of the family left, and that's what I was interested in finding out.
After another presentation of this, a distant cousin came up and mentioned that he was a distant cousin, but I didn't get a chance to talk to him. Interestingly, although Dr. Howell spoke to a lot of people in Clinton, or people who were friends with the boys, we had almost no communication from Joe Albritton's family. The brief communication I had with a niece, I think it is, didn't express a lot of interest in the project. So. But thank you for asking that.
Actually, we do have a question that has come in from the live stream. Did any of those who returned express an opinion about General Douglas MacArthur or President Harry Truman?
Not that we know of. I'm sure they had opinions. I didn't bring that out, but I think it was in March or early April of '51, just before Joe, Homer, and Walter arrived in Korea, was when Truman sacked MacArthur for insubordination and probably other things. If they had thoughts about it, they probably weren't thinking too much about it at the time, but maybe later had thoughts about it. As you know, MacArthur was immensely popular here. He was very popular in Japan. You know, he was head of the occupation forces there. But he engaged.
I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is, why was the Korean War considered the forgotten war?
Okay.
And the second is, were the vets who survived and came back, they had to have some forms, some levels of PSTD.
Oh.
And I'm wondering about the service paid to them, and as we now have help for those vets who survived the wars.
In answer to the first question, as I explained, I think it's called America's Forgotten War because it sort of got lost after World War II. And I think Americans were tired of war. It wasn't popular here at all, kind of like Vietnam turned out to be the next decade. It's not literally forgotten, but so few, relatively few Americans served over there that there wasn't that huge number of them like there were World War II veterans. The second question, I referred to one of the men who came back as suffering, from memories of Korea. Actually, one or two others did too. I don't think any of them that I'm aware of had any, professional counseling that was provided by the VA. That did not come out in the interviews. It was a traumatic war, though, and I'm sure many American soldiers suffered.
I'm just curious, one of the most famous wars that I was familiar with was Pork Chop Hill.
Yeah.
And I have two questions. Were anything in the book about that they was fought near or close to Pork Chop Hill, and was Pork Chop Hill above the militarized zone, or was it in South Korea?
I'm not sure exactly that's not in the book because he was focusing on the Marines and particularly the guys from Clinton who were not there. I think Porkchop Hill may have been near the Punch Bowl area, which I did refer to. Heartbreak Ridge, and there's another one that was pretty well known, was in that area. But there's a good bit in the book about the Army. There was a lot of, I guess, tension between the Army and the Marines, and even before the war started, in the efforts to downsize the American military after World War II, you know, the Marines were, well, some people tried to eliminate Marines entirely. They wanted to downsize the Marines, make it part of the Navy, all sorts of things like that. So he was trying to focus just on the Marines there. Is that it? Thank you.
Thank you all. We have copies of the book for sale. I hope that we'll see you later this week and next week. Help me thank Tom Henderson for this fantastic program today.
Thank you.